Good evening, fellow adventurers. How are you today? I hope you're doing well and ready to journey through time together with Nightly Historian. The night before the invasion smelled of salt and steel. Across the English Channel, thousands of ships waited in total darkness, engines humming beneath the waves like a restless heartbeat. Soldiers lay awake, listening to the wind and imagining what dawn might bring. Some whispered prayers. Some tried to sleep. Most simply stared into the night, knowing history was only hours away. Far from the water, far from the soldiers who would soon face fire and fear, another battle was already being won in silence. It was a battle not of force, but of imagination, fought with letters, radio transmissions, and a man's absolute dedication to a lie so perfect, so convincing, that it reshaped the destiny of nations before the first Allied soldier touched French sand. This is the story of Juan Pujol Garcia, the man MI5 would come to call Garbo, a man who fought tyranny not with bullets, but with words. A quiet, stubborn, endlessly creative man who built an entire army out of thin air and made some of the most powerful military planners in Europe believe every word of it. To understand how a single individual altered the course of the war, we begin far from the beaches of Normandy, in a country fractured by its own civil war, Spain. Juan Pujol was born into a comfortable middle-class family in Barcelona. He did not grow up dreaming of espionage or secret missions. He dreamed only of living in a peaceful world, far away from cruelty and oppression. But life had different plans for him. As Spain descended into civil conflict during the 1930s, Pujol saw firsthand how fragile freedom could be. He witnessed cruelty from multiple factions, and he emerged from the chaos with one unshakable conviction. He despised totalitarianism in all its forms. He would later say that the war in Spain taught him the value of human dignity, and that he felt an obligation to defend it wherever he could. When the Second World War erupted across Europe, Pujol watched with rising frustration. Britain and the Allied powers were fighting for the survival of democratic civilization. He wanted to help them, yet he had no skills, no intelligence background, no reason to be trusted. He walked away discouraged, but not defeated. If the British would not let him help them, perhaps he could find another way. And so began one of the most astonishing journeys in the history of espionage. Unable to join the Allies officially, Pujol chose a path that defied logic. He decided to infiltrate the Axis intelligence service on his own terms, with no training and no supervision, in order to sabotage them from within. It was madness. It was genius. It was the beginning of Garbo. He approached the German embassy in Madrid with an entirely fabricated backstory, claiming to be a loyal supporter of their regime and eager to serve as a spy in Britain. The intelligence officers there, constantly searching for new assets, found his eagerness suspicious, yet oddly compelling. War often bends the rules of judgment, and they eventually gave him a chance. Pujol walked out of the embassy with a codename, a cipher, and a mission he never intended to accomplish. His assignment was to infiltrate England, gather intelligence, and report military movements. But instead of traveling to Britain, Pujol bought a tourist guidebook, a handful of English newspapers, and a map. He used these simple tools to fabricate entire letters of intelligence that he sent back to the German handlers. He wrote detailed descriptions of Liverpool shipyards, British morale, troop deployments,
all stitched together from maps, imagination, and bits of news he gathered from public sources. But what made his early reports so believable was not their accuracy, but their imperfections. Pujol understood something fundamental about effective deception. Truth must be mixed with believable error. He invented fictional informants, dock workers, soldiers, airmen, each with names, personalities, habits, and flaws. He created a sprawling spy network that existed only in his head, yet Berlin believed in it completely. His reports were long, emotional, and crafted with the tone of a man genuinely afraid of being caught. German intelligence officers began to value him highly, praising the quality of his network and rewarding him with increasing trust.
Still, Pujol knew he could not maintain this deception forever without support. He continued trying to contact the British, sending messages, requesting meetings, insisting that he had something valuable to offer them, but his attempts were ignored or dismissed. Meanwhile, his reports grew more elaborate. He described entire ship convoys moving through British ports, convoys that never existed. He created stories of soldiers complaining about food shortages, aircraft divisions training in Scotland, and political debates inside Parliament. All of it fiction, yet all of it consumed eagerly by German military planners. Eventually, by late 1941, British intelligence became aware of a peculiar phenomenon. German military messages contained information that clearly originated from a spy who did not exist in Britain. They traced the source back to Madrid, to an untrained volunteer with a knack for making fiction look real. MI5 contacted him at last. And when Juan Pujol Garcia stepped onto British soil for the first time, he was no longer a nobody. He was Garbo, the greatest actor the war had never seen. London assigned him a desk, a radio operator, and 2 case officers. They brought him into the heart of MI5's deception unit. Pujol, working with the full machinery of British intelligence behind him, began expanding his imaginary network. This was the moment when the lies of a single man would become a critical weapon in the Allied arsenal.
When Pujol entered MI5 headquarters for the first time, he walked not into a world of spies, but into a labyrinth of paperwork, suspicion, and cigarette smoke. Intelligence work, he quickly learned, was less about cloak-and-dagger theatrics and more about decoding the human mind, understanding motive, and shaping perception. And Pujol, to everyone's surprise, possessed a natural instinct for all 3. The officers in charge of deception read through the letters he had sent to the German intelligence service. They expected to find the work of an amateur. Instead, they found a masterpiece. Carefully balanced details, believable errors, emotional undertones, and patterns that mirrored how real informants behaved. One senior officer whispered to another, "He fooled Berlin without us. Imagine what he can do with us." And so, they decided to take a chance. The MI5 handlers assigned to Pujol were Thomas Harris and Cyril Kalkahorn. Harris was artistic, fluent in Spanish, and had a sympathy for unconventional minds. Kalkahorn was structured, methodical, and calm. Together they formed the perfect balance, creativity and discipline, bound together by a common mission. They gave Juan a new code name, Garbo. The name was a tribute to Greta Garbo, the legendary actress, because Juan was, in essence, performing the greatest role of his life. The name stuck immediately, and everyone in MI5 quickly adopted it. With a safe house, a radio operator, and full access to British military movements, Pujol now had everything he needed to weave illusions at a scale he had never attempted before. His imaginary spy network, once 6 or 7 fictional individuals, exploded into dozens. He wrote biographies for them, detailed personal quirks, financial problems, romantic struggles, petty disagreements, children, pets. He breathed life into shadows. The German handlers, unaware that their star agent had never even visited a British port, began praising his network as one of the most reliable in their entire intelligence system. They sent him money for his informants, salaries, bribes, and operative costs. MI5 quietly absorbed the funds and wrote receipts on behalf of people who weren't real. As weeks turned into months, Garbo grew bolder. He submitted reports about troop movements in Scotland, training camps in Wales, and political opinions inside London. He fabricated shipping delays, naval shortages, and internal arguments within British command, knowing full well that Germany's intelligence service found chaos in enemy ranks comforting. But deception is more complex than simply inventing believable lies. Pujol understood something deeper, the human desire to believe. He exploited that desire with remarkable precision. If Berlin wanted to hear that Britain was unprepared, he told them Britain was unprepared. If they wanted to hear that morale was weakening, he wrote letters filled with stories of discouraged soldiers and exhausted commanders. Every report was not just a story, it was a psychological gift crafted for the listener. Yet the more successful he became, the more dangerous the work grew. Deception is a fragile web. One inconsistency, one missed detail, one report that contradicted reality, and everything could collapse. Garbo worked obsessively, often late into the night, reviewing past letters, checking timelines, cross-referencing names that had never existed. Harris often found him hunched over a desk, surrounded by papers, scribbling notes on troop positions and supply chains as if they were real. "You are creating a country inside your mind," Harris once said quietly. Pujol smiled. "A country they choose to believe in." MI5 realized that they did not just have a spy, they had an artist. As the war intensified across Europe, British High Command began preparing for something unprecedented, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. The success of this invasion depended on secrecy, not just keeping the real landing location hidden, but convincing the enemy to look in the wrong direction entirely. This was the beginning of Operation Fortitude, the master deception that would support the D-Day landings. It required actors, inflatable tanks, forged documents, misinformation campaigns, and the most credible double agents in Europe. At the center of it all was Garbo.
His reports became the backbone of the operation. Every line he sent was carefully designed to reinforce a single illusion: that the Allied invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. He built an imaginary army group, the first U.S. Army group, commanded by General George Patton. He described supply movements, training exercises, new airfields, and divisions massing in southeastern England. None of it existed. But the Berlin leadership believed every word. They requested more detail. Garbo provided it. They asked for aerial reconnaissance. British forces showed them inflatable tanks and wooden airplanes positioned exactly where Garbo claimed real ones were. They demanded confirmation from other spies. MI5 let German agents transmit small fragments of information that subtly reinforced Garbo's narrative. This collaboration between Garbo and the broader deception machine was seamless. It was as though the entire operation moved to the rhythm of one imagination, his. Yet deception, even perfect deception, takes a toll. Pujol's days were filled with transmissions and drafts. His nights were often restless. Maintaining nearly 30 fictional informants was a psychological burden few could imagine. Each time Berlin wrote back with praise, promotions, or requests, he felt a weight pressing on his conscience. He often wondered if his lies would one day cost innocent lives. But MI5 reminded him gently and repeatedly that deception was the difference between a catastrophic invasion and a successful one. Lives would be lost regardless. His lies would help reduce the number. Pujol accepted the logic, but the emotional burden remained. Still, he pressed forward. The war demanded it. The invasion demanded it, and history would later show that no single liar in the war was more essential than Garbo.
Operation Fortitude was unlike anything the world had seen. It was not a battle of tanks or ships, but a battle of perceptions, fought in the shadows between what the enemy feared and what they expected. The Allied command understood that even the strongest army could be weakened by a well-placed illusion, and Garbo was the illusionist at the center of it all. In a quiet office in London, Pujol sat beside his assigned radio operator as they transmitted messages across Europe. Each message had to be crafted with precision. Too vague, and Berlin would grow suspicious. Too detailed, and the lie would collapse under its own weight. He wrote slowly, thoughtfully, placing each sentence like bricks in a fortress. He described the buildup of a massive assault force in southeast England, soldiers training relentlessly, supply trucks lining the roads, aircraft filling the skies above Kent. The reality, however, was that these divisions did not exist. Some were entirely fictional. Others were stationed hundreds of miles away. MI5 helped bring his illusions to life. Inflatable tanks were rolled onto fields. Wooden aircraft were arranged on runways. Fake radio chatter filled the airwaves. Troops marched in patterns designed to fool reconnaissance. From the sky to enemy analysts, it all looked unmistakably real. Garbo's greatest strength was not just deception, it was consistency. Every report he sent aligned perfectly with the broader illusion, each lie reinforcing the last, until the entire narrative felt inevitable. In the cold logic of enemy intelligence rooms, the picture was clear. The Allies were preparing to strike at Pas-de-Calais. But Pujol knew the truth, that the real invasion would happen at Normandy. And the closer the date came, the heavier the responsibility felt. To mislead an entire military machine was one thing. To mislead it at the precise moment lives depended on it was something else entirely. Garbo maintained his fictional network with increasing complexity. One of his agents reported tension in military camps near Dover. Another described overcrowded supply depots. Yet another claimed to have overheard British officers discussing a secret meeting with General Patton. Each detail, fabricated or exaggerated, became a thread weaving the tapestry of deception. The German High Command increasingly relied on his intelligence. His reports were forwarded to top-level generals. They were read aloud in strategy meetings. Commanders adjusted troop positions based on information that came directly from Garbo's imagination.
As the pressure intensified, MI5 kept a close eye on him. They feared burnout, miscalculations, or small errors that could expose the entire deception. But Pujol worked with a kind of quiet fervor. He believed deeply in the cause. To him, each lie was a shield protecting thousands of Allied soldiers who would soon step onto the beaches of France. One evening, as rain tapped against the windows of his London office, Harris leaned over and asked him softly, "Do you ever fear they will discover the truth?" Pujol exhaled slowly. "Every day," he whispered. "But fear is part of the work, no? A spy without fear is not a spy." The closer June came, the more tense the atmosphere grew. Allied commanders argued over timing. Weather forecasters debated storm fronts. Soldiers drilled through nights and fog. And inside a dim room in London, Garbo crafted the final act of his deception, one that would determine the fate of the coming invasion. He began sending messages suggesting that British leadership was holding back its strongest divisions for a later, larger strike, the real invasion, which would follow the anticipated assault at Normandy. He reinforced the idea that Normandy, if they happened at all, would merely be a distraction, a feint designed to draw enemy forces away from Pas-de-Calais. The brilliance of his plan was its simplicity. He didn't need to convince the enemy that Normandy was a trick. He needed to convince them that Normandy was not worth reacting to. The enemy leadership, already biased towards expecting an attack at Calais, eagerly accepted his version of events. Garbo had found not only the perfect lie, but the perfect audience. Meanwhile, MI5 and Allied planners were staging the largest deception infrastructure ever assembled. Operation Fortitude South, which focused on reinforcing the illusion of a Calais invasion, was integrated with Garbo's messages. Together, they formed a symphony of misinformation.
Fake radio networks crackled with communications between phantom divisions. Inflatable tanks shimmered under the summer sun. Entire camps lit their lanterns each night, only to extinguish them before dawn as decoy soldiers marched in choreographed patterns. When aerial photos were captured, enemy analysts circled tents, trucks, and supply stacks with growing certainty. The deception was complete. All that remained was to maintain the illusion for as long as necessary. The pressure on Garbo became immense. Each message he sent was reviewed by senior intelligence officers. Each sentence carried responsibility. He had to speak to enemy expectations without sounding too eager. He had to mirror their thinking while guiding it. He had to mislead them without revealing his intent. His fictional network, now nearly 30 characters, had become a living organism inside his mind. He tracked each agent's personality, motivations, fears, and limitations. He wrote about their illnesses, their frustrations, their changing circumstances. They were more real to him than the people in his own apartment building. As he leaned over his writing desk late into the night, he often wondered what would happen if the enemy discovered they were being manipulated by ghosts. The thought haunted him, not because he feared punishment, but because the entire invasion relied on the illusion holding firm. Every sound outside startled him. Every radio crackle carried weight. Every letter he drafted could shape the course of the war. And yet he continued, calm, methodical, driven by the belief that deception, if used with purpose, could save more lives than any weapon ever forged. The night before D-Day began like a slow, trembling breath across the coast of southern England. The sea grew restless under low clouds, and the wind rolled through the dark water with a chilling warning. Storms had battered the channel for days, delaying the invasion and fraying already fragile nerves. Yet beneath that turbulence, a sense of finality hung in the air, a quiet understanding that history had chosen this moment, this night. Across the hidden ports of England, ships were lined up in eerie silence. Soldiers climbed aboard landing crafts with somber faces, their boots splashing in the shallow water. Officers whispered instructions under the dim light of covered lanterns. Every man knew that when the sun rose, the world would change forever. Whether for better or worse, no one could say. In a cramped MI5 office in London, far from the waves, far from the smell of fuel and salt, Garbo sat at his desk with a pencil in hand. He was exhausted, his eyes red from endless days of drafting messages, but he knew he had one last task before the invasion, to send the most critical broadcast of his life. The deception had to continue, but it had to be done carefully. The enemy needed to be informed of the invasion, but the timing had to be perfect. Too early, and reinforcements might be sent to Normandy. Too late, and the message would lose its credibility. It was a razor's edge, a delicate dance between truth and manipulation. Pujol leaned back in his chair, listening to the steady hum of the radio equipment beside him. The air smelled of dust and warm circuits. His radio operator glanced at him with a mixture of fatigue and anticipation. They both understood the stakes. They both knew that within hours, the greatest amphibious assault in history would begin. MI5 officers hovered nearby, watching the room with quiet intensity. Their faces reflected the gravity of the moment. They were men accustomed to intelligence work, but this felt different. Everything they had done, everything they had planned, depended now on the illusion holding firm. To Garbo, the weight felt heavier than ever. His reports had shaped enemy thinking for months. He had convinced an entire intelligence network that a massive army was preparing to attack Pas-de-Calais. But now, as the invasion fleet began its journey across the Channel, the truth would become visible. If the enemy leaders doubted him now, even for a single moment, the consequences would be catastrophic. A storm rattled the windows. The lights flickered. Pujol looked down at the sheet of paper before him, the draft of his final pre-invasion message. His pulse quickened. His hands were steady, but his breath came slower than usual, deeper, heavier, as if his mind recognized the significance of each word. He wrote about seeing troop movements on the south coast. He described soldiers loading onto landing craft. He reported that something unusual was happening, but he stopped short of stating clearly that an invasion was underway. The goal was not to warn the enemy. The goal was to appear as a loyal agent who was trying to warn them while ensuring the message arrived too late.
Pujol glanced at the clock. He and his handlers calculated the perfect delay. A message sent now would be received by the German intelligence center hours later, hours too late to be useful. The invasion would already have begun. Enemy leaders would assume the Normandy attack was a feint. They would continue to hold their armored divisions at Calais. Garbo inhaled slowly and nodded to the radio operator. "Send it," he whispered. The operator began transmitting, tapping the coded message into the ether. Each click of the transmitter was a heartbeat in the dark room. MI5 officers stood perfectly still, watching, listening, waiting. When the transmission was complete, Pujol closed his eyes. For a moment, the room was silent except for the soft hum of machines. He felt the weight of the work settle on his shoulders. This message, more than any other, would define his legacy. Outside, the Channel storm began to ease. Winds calmed. The invasion fleet moved forward. Hours later, enemy interception centers received Garbo's urgent warning. Analysts read his words with serious focus. His credibility, built over years, made the message feel urgent and sincere. But the timing was poor. The commanders who needed the information were either sleeping, traveling, or unreachable. By the time the message reached the desks of the High Command, Allied forces were already landing in Normandy. The timing was perfect. The deception was complete. Even as reports from Normandy flooded in, from coastal defenses, from field officers, from radar stations, senior German commanders refused to believe it was the real invasion. Garbo had conditioned them too well. For months, he had told them that the main attack would come at Calais, that the Allies were preparing their strongest divisions for that region, that Normandy was merely a diversion. Now, confronted with reality, they chose to trust the illusion instead.
Garbo's influence reached higher than he ever imagined. Enemy high command ordered their armored divisions to hold back. Reinforcements remained stationed near Calais. The fear of a second larger invasion immobilized experience of his impact that morning. He sat in the MI5 office, listening to the radio, hearing scattered reports of the landings. He felt anxious, unsure, caught between relief and dread. He had done his part, but success would depend on countless other variables beyond his control. Hours passed, the invasion held, the beachheads grew, the Allies endured. MI5 received new intercepts from the enemy, revealing their interpretation of events. They believed Garbo's reports. They believed Normandy was a diversion. They believed Calais remained the true target. A wave of relief swept through British intelligence offices. Officers exhaled, some for the first time in days. They shook hands, they closed their eyes in gratitude. Some simply sat down, exhausted, overwhelmed by the enormity of what had been avoided. Garbo, however, did not celebrate. He remained seated, staring at the map of France pinned to the wall. His expression was calm, almost solemn. For all the success, he felt the weight of what the coming days would bring. Battles, casualties, destruction. Even a successful invasion was still a tragedy written in blood. But he had done what he set out to do. His lies had saved countless lives. His deception had shaped the fate of Europe. As the sun rose over the English Channel that morning, its light touched both the soldiers on the beaches and the quiet Spaniard who had helped them reach that shore.
Over the next 2 weeks, Garbo's influence only grew stronger. He informed the enemy leadership that the Normandy attack was merely the first phase of a larger operation. He claimed that once the enemy committed forces to counter the Normandy landings, the main blow would strike at Calais. His handlers in Berlin repeated these analyses to their superiors. High command absorbed them eagerly. The illusion became self-sustaining. Enemy divisions that could have crushed the early Allied lines remained frozen. Trains loaded with reinforcements stayed parked in rail yards. Commanders read Garbo's letters and concluded that the enemy was waiting for the perfect moment to strike the decisive blow. Even after a full month had passed, Garbo insisted that the main assault was still forthcoming. Enemy confidence in his analysis never wavered. They continued to monitor the imaginary army group he had described. They tracked non-existent troop movements. They analyzed radio traffic that MI5 had carefully scripted for them. Every deception held firm, a testament not just to strategic planning, but to Pujol's uncanny ability to turn fiction into something indistinguishable from truth. Behind the scenes, MI5 officers marveled at the extent of his influence. Harris once remarked that Garbo has built an empire of ghosts. Colquhoun added, quieter but more thoughtful, and Berlin kneels before them. Months after D-Day, Garbo's handlers informed him that he had been nominated for a prestigious military honor. The irony would have been comical if the stakes had not been so serious. For his loyal service, the German command granted him the Iron Cross, one of the highest military decorations of their armed forces. MI5 received the news with a mixture of disbelief and grim amusement. Garbo had succeeded beyond anything they imagined possible. They even arranged for him to receive a physical medal after the war, a symbol of a deception so perfect that the very people he undermined had rewarded him for it.
In the hours after the invasion began, chaos erupted across the French coast. Shore batteries fired blindly through the fog. Field commanders sent frantic messages pleading for reinforcements. Tanks moved cautiously along muddy roads, unsure of which direction the real threat would emerge. The world had stepped into a storm of uncertainty,
Yet one man's voice in London remained the steady, unseen current shaping events across the front. Garbo continued transmitting calmly. Even as reports from Normandy intensified, he emphasized that every indication still pointed to a larger force being held back, a force preparing for Calais. This message, repeated with unwavering consistency, reassured the enemy intelligence officers that their assumptions were correct. Normandy was a feint. The real invasion was imminent. In Berlin, senior military planners clung to their original belief, not because evidence supported it, but because Garbo had nurtured it for months. They had invested trust, resources, and emotional confidence into his intelligence. To abandon it now would mean admitting they had been outmaneuvered. Confirmation bias became their invisible cage. One general, reading Garbo's post-invasion messages, reportedly insisted that enemy forces in Normandy were merely an opening gesture. Another reminded his staff that the 1st U.S. Army Group, supposedly under General Patton, had not yet moved. They waited and waited while Allied forces strengthened their grip on the beachheads. In London, MI5 analysts watched intercepts come in with fascination. They could see the effect of Garbo's work in real time. Reports describing enemy hesitation, delayed movements, and misallocated resources painted a clear picture. The deception had succeeded beyond all expectations. Garbo's messages continued with the same emotional tone he had always used: earnest, self-sacrificing, loyal. He wrote of his exhaustion, of the sleepless nights he claimed to endure for the cause, and of how desperately he wished he could have warned his handlers earlier. His sincerity, even though entirely fabricated, deepened their belief in him. Meanwhile, Allied forces were pushing inland from Normandy, inching forward through hedgerows, villages, and fortified positions. Every hour that enemy armored divisions stayed at Calais was an hour bought with deception, an hour that saved thousands of lives.
But Pujol did not celebrate. He accepted the honor with modesty, but inside he felt a strange sadness. The medal symbolized the extent of the illusion, yes, but it also symbolized the tragedy of war itself, where lies shaped decisions and millions suffered for the beliefs of a few. As the Allies pushed further into France, liberating city after city, Garbo continued feeding false reports, maintaining the illusion until it was no longer needed. The fictional 1st U.S. Army Group began to disperse slowly in his messages, explained through plausible reasons: reassignments, supply constraints, strategic pauses. When the deception was finally retired, Berlin never questioned why the invasion at Calais never materialized. They simply assumed the Allies had changed their plans. Pujol grew quieter during these months. The intensity of the deception had taken a toll on him. Sleepless nights, constant focus, the moral pressure of knowing his lies could shift the fate of thousands, all weighed heavily on his spirit. He often walked alone through the quiet streets of London during the evenings, reflecting on the extraordinary path that had brought him here. The city was still dimly lit under wartime restrictions, but in the darkness he found a strange comfort. He had helped it save, not with a rifle or a uniform, but with persistence and imagination. His MI5 handlers began to sense that the war for Garbo had become deeply personal. He spoke of his childhood in Barcelona, of witnessing cruelty during the Civil War, of the helplessness he once felt. Now, deception had given him agency, a way to fight oppression in a manner uniquely his own. By the time the Allies had crossed into Belgium, Pujol's role in the war was essentially complete. His fictional network was retired. His transmissions grew infrequent. The web of lies he had woven began to dissolve. Yet even as his operational role faded, his impact continued to ripple across Europe. Commanders, historians, and intelligence officers would later confirm what Garbo already suspected. His deception saved lives. Countless lives. The invasion had been secured, not just by courage, but by crafted illusions. And the man behind those illusions was not a trained spy, not a soldier, not a high-ranking official. He was a former poultry farmer with a conscience sharper than any blade and a determination that reshaped history.
When the war in Europe began collapsing, the streets of London filled with a cautious sense of hope. Newspapers printed the slow, steady progress of Allied troops as they pushed deeper into enemy territory. Radios crackled with announcements of liberated cities, broken lines, and the fall of once impenetrable fortresses. The world was shifting from darkness toward the possibility of dawn. In MI5's quiet corridors, however, there was a different atmosphere, one of closure. The deception units, once buzzing with coded messages and secret drafts, grew still. Operation Fortitude was no longer necessary. Garbo's vast network of imaginary agents had served their purpose. The ghosts he had created could finally be allowed to fade. For Juan Pujol Garcia, the end of the war brought a strange mix of relief and melancholy. His life had been defined by deception for years, a deception that demanded constant vigilance, creativity, and emotional discipline. When the transmission stopped and the radio fell silent, he felt an emptiness, as though something vital had been removed from his very being. He found himself walking through London in quiet reflection. The city bore the scars of war: shattered windows, bombed-out shells of buildings, memorial notices pinned to doorways. And yet he sensed a resilience beneath it all, a courage reflected in the faces of ordinary people who had endured so much. Sometimes he would linger near the Thames, watching the water move calmly under the bridges, thinking of all the unseen currents that shaped history, the hidden decisions, the small acts of bravery, the lies that saved thousands. He wondered where he fit within those currents. Was he a hero, as some in MI5 suggested, or merely a man who had played a necessary role in a cruel and unforgiving world? As the war neared the conclusion, MI5 made a decision that surprised him. They recommended that Pujol receive a British honor for his service, a quiet recognition for a man who had shaped one of the most important military decisions of the century. But the award, though meaningful, came with a heavy truth. Garbo's safety could no longer be guaranteed. The German leadership, having trusted him deeply, would not appreciate discovering the scale of his betrayal. Revenge, even years after the war, was not unthinkable. Intelligence agencies around the world assured MI5 that certain individuals might attempt to track down Garbo to settle old scores. Pujol understood the risk. Betraying an empire, even through lies, was not something easily forgiven. Thus began the slow process of erasing Juan Pujol Garcia from the world. MI5 helped arrange a new identity for him. They forged documents, created a new personal history, and provided him with a destination where no one would think to search: Caracas, Venezuela. It was a place far removed from the battlefields of Europe, a world of humid nights, tall mountains, and vast forests.
Before he left London, Pujol had one last meeting with Thomas Harris. The two men, who had built the greatest deception of the war side by side, sat together in a quiet room, drinking coffee in the dim afternoon light. Harris looked at him with affection and sadness. "You know," he said softly, "history may never fully understand what you've done." Pujol smiled, weary but sincere. History doesn't need to understand. It only needs to endure. Harris nodded. There was nothing more to say. Their work, their extraordinary, impossible work, was complete. When Pujol boarded the ship for South America, he felt the strange sensation of stepping not into a new life, but into a shadow of one. The horizon stretched endlessly before him, the sea calm and reflective under the drifting clouds. He leaned against the railing, watching the water ripple and reform beneath the hull, thinking of all the identities he had worn. Husband, farmer, liar, spy, savior. The ship carried him across the Atlantic, far from the country that had become his covert home. When he stepped onto Venezuelan soil, the air felt different, warmer, heavier, unfamiliar. The streets were busy with vendors, the sound of Spanish chatter filling the air. It was strangely comforting to hear his native language spoken so freely again, yet he remained alone, unknown, and unseen. Pujol opened a small business, raised a family, and lived quietly under his new name. He tended to chickens once more, just as he had before the war. The work was simple, repetitive, grounding, a way of life far removed from the labyrinth of secrets and lies he had once navigated. Years passed. He remained hidden from the world. He heard the occasional rumor of books being written about D-Day, documentaries made about intelligence operations, films produced about the war. Sometimes he wondered if anyone suspected that the man who had shaped Operation Fortitude was now selling eggs in a Venezuelan market. He never said a word. Silence became his ally.
Yet the silence also weighed on him. He watched his children grow up without knowing the truth of who their father was. He carried memories that no one around him shared. People spoke of the war casually, with half-remembered stories and distant admiration, not realizing that the man beside them had played a central role in its outcome. It wasn't until the 1970s, nearly 30 years after D-Day, that a British historian researching deception operations uncovered something unexpected. He found hints of a master double agent named Garbo, a man whose identity had been concealed, whose fate was unknown. This discovery sent ripples through the historical community. Files were reopened, records were traced, names were cross-referenced. The historian traveled across continents, following faint threads of evidence, until he reached Caracas. There, in a small, modest home surrounded by chickens and fruit trees, he found an elderly man with a quiet gaze and a calm voice. When the historian introduced himself and explained his research, Pujol hesitated. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with the faintest smile, he replied, "I was waiting for someone to come." It was the first time he had spoken openly about his past in decades. The rediscovery of Garbo's true identity was met with astonishment. Newspapers published stories about him, documentaries sought to interview him, scholars debated the nature of his work. But Pujol himself remained humble. He insisted that he was merely a man who did what he felt was right in a world losing its moral compass. He traveled briefly to Europe, visiting London once more. As he walked along the Thames, older now, his steps slower, he felt a rush of memories. The nights spent drafting messages, the carefully timed transmissions, the overwhelming responsibility of deception. The city looked different, brighter, freer, but beneath its newness he sensed the echoes of the war he had once fought from within its walls. He visited Normandy, standing quietly on the beaches he had helped protect from afar. The waves washed gently over the sand, and the wind moved through the cliffs. He felt a deep stillness within himself. The cost of the invasion had been immense, yet the world built from its aftermath had endured. When he returned to Venezuela, he carried with him a sense of closure. He had been Garbo, the man who fooled an empire, but he had also been Juan, the man who sought only to defend human dignity in the only way he could.
Both identities lived within him, intertwined like threads of the same tapestry. He died in 1988, quietly, surrounded by his family. Few outside intelligence circles knew his name. Fewer still understood the magnitude of what he had done.
History is often written around great battles, heroic charges, and the thunder of artillery. But the story of Garbo reminds us that sometimes the most decisive victories happen in silence, in quiet rooms lit by dim lamps, in coded messages transmitted through static-filled radios, in lies crafted with precision and purpose. When historians speak of D-Day, they speak of bravery, sacrifice, and liberation. They speak of soldiers storming the beaches under then-fire, pilots flying through dangerous skies, and sailors navigating treacherous waters. These stories are rightfully honored. They reflect the courage that shaped the modern world. But there is another layer to this history, hidden beneath the surface, like the foundation of a building. It is the layer built by men and women who worked in shadows, shaping perceptions instead of landscapes, guiding decisions instead of bullets. Garbo was one of the finest among them, a man whose weapon was not a rifle, but a narrative. His deception bought precious hours during the invasion, hours in which beachheads solidified, reinforcements landed, and momentum grew. Hours that transformed the invasion from a desperate gamble into an unfolding victory. The lives saved by those hours can never be fully counted, but their echoes remain in every story told about that day. Reflecting on Garbo's work raises profound questions about truth and morality. Can lies ever serve justice? Can deception be an instrument of peace? On the surface, the idea feels contradictory. Yet, in the context of war, a conflict defined by destruction and cruelty, Garbo's lies became bridges to a better future.
He never glorified what he did. He never presented himself as heroic. When asked later in life how he viewed his role, he simply said, "I did what conscience asked of me." It was a quiet answer, one that spoke volumes. In a world burning with conflict, he chose to defend humanity not through violence, but through intellect. There is something deeply human about Pujol's journey. He began as an ordinary man, a man with doubts, fears, and frustrations, but he refused to stand by and watch tyranny spread unchecked. He found a way, however unconventional, to shape the world around him. His life is a reminder that bravery comes in many forms, some seen, many unseen. Today, intelligence agencies study his methods, scholars write about him, and filmmakers depict his story. Yet, for all the attention he receives now, it is important to remember that for decades he lived in silence, forgotten by the world he helped save. His anonymity was both protection and punishment. But perhaps it was also a testament to his character, a man who never sought fame, only purpose. When we stand on the shores of Normandy today, listening to the waves roll in, we hear more than the sound of the sea. We hear the echoes of stories woven into that coastline. Some are loud and heroic, others are quiet and hidden. Garbo's story is one of those quiet ones, a whisper woven into the wind. In many ways, Garbo symbolizes the complexity of war itself. He represents the paradox that in order to preserve truth, sometimes one must master deception. That in order...
Good evening, fellow adventurers. How are you today? I hope you're doing well and ready to journey through time together with Nightly Historian.
For 30 years, the world moved on, but one man did not. While nations rebuilt, children grew into adults, and an entire generation forgot the sounds of gunfire, Hiro Onoda remained hidden beneath the canopy of a tropical jungle, holding his rifle, guarding his orders, convinced that the war he served had never truly ended. To understand why, we must begin long before the jungle swallowed him. We must step into a time when Japan still believed in an empire of destiny, when obedience was sacred, and when surrender was not just unthinkable, it was shame itself. His story is not merely about endurance, but about the human mind's ability to cling to meaning long after the world has abandoned it. Hiro Onoda was born in 1922 in Japan's Wakayama Prefecture, surrounded by traditions older than memory itself. His childhood was shaped by discipline, silence, and the belief that one's duty to the nation was absolute. There was no hint then that he would become one of the most enigmatic figures of the 20th century. He was an ordinary boy, raised in an extraordinary culture. As he grew older, the world was changing in ways no one could predict. Japan's rising militarization seeped into everyday life, transforming schools into training grounds and shaping young minds around loyalty and sacrifice. For Onoda, these ideas were not burdens, they were structure, purpose, a path forward. When he entered adulthood, the empire was already deep in conflict across Asia and the Pacific. And as the war expanded, so did the demand for soldiers capable not only of fighting, but of surviving. Onoda's unique blend of calmness, determination, and obedience made him an ideal candidate for a very different kind of assignment, one that required not strength, but unwavering faith. In the early 1940s, the Japanese Army identified recruits suitable for specialized training in guerrilla warfare. These were not soldiers meant to win battles. They were soldiers meant to outlast them. Their mission was simple in theory, but impossible in practice. Infiltrate, disrupt, and gather intelligence, and above all, never surrender. Onoda braced this path without hesitation. It was not bravado or pride. It was duty, a word he understood as one might understand gravity, something that holds you to the earth, whether you wish it to or not.
Among these orders was one that defined his fate. You must never die by your own hand, and under no circumstances may you surrender. This was not optional. This was not metaphor. This was doctrine. When Onoda completed his training, the empire sent him to a small island in the Philippines called Lubang. He arrived in late 1944, a young intelligence officer with a precise mission: destroy enemy supplies, maintain guerrilla pressure, and gather information. If the main Japanese forces retreated, he was not to retreat with them. If the war appeared lost, he was not to believe it. If anyone tried to convince him otherwise, he was to assume it was part of an enemy trick. Lubang's jungle greeted him with dense humidity, towering trees, and a silence broken only by insects and distant waves. It was not a battlefield in the traditional sense. It was a labyrinth of green, a place where truth disappeared between shadows. Onoda studied it carefully, learning its paths, its hiding places, and its dangers. He did not know then that this jungle would become his home for 3 decades. As 1945 approached, the situation in the Pacific worsened. Japan's defeat drew closer with each passing week. But to Onoda and his small group of comrades, the world outside the jungle remained unseen, abstract, unreachable. All they knew were their orders: orders that did not change even as the empire crumbled. In February 1945, American forces launched their assault on Lubang. The Japanese troops stationed there were quickly overwhelmed, and many were forced to
Listened for signals, searched for surviving comrades, and waited for new commands. But none came. They saw leaflets dropped from aircraft, papers claiming that the war had ended. They found newspapers declaring Japan's surrender. They heard announcements played through speakers by local police, urging them to come out. But Onoda had been trained well. He knew the enemy used deception. He had been taught that surrender propaganda was common, and so he dismissed every message, every leaflet, every plea as a trap. The more the world tried to reach him, the deeper he retreated into his mission. As months became years, the jungle stopped being a temporary refuge and became his universe. Time lost its meaning. Seasons blended into each other. The only truths that remained were the orders he had received, orders he had never been told to abandon. The island became a vast and living clock. The cicadas signaled heat. The storms signaled hunger. The rustling leaves at dusk signaled danger. Onoda learned to read the forest as one might read a language. Food was scarce. They rationed everything: rice, coconuts, captured livestock, even wild plants they barely recognized. Illness was constant. Nights were cold. Days were harsh. But through it all, Onoda held fast to his purpose, to continue the war, no matter how long it took. As the 1950s arrived, Lubang's villagers began reporting sightings of Japanese holdouts in the jungle. Occasionally, shots were fired in the dark. Farmers whispered about figures stealing rice or killing livestock. Local law enforcement tried to make contact, urging the soldiers to surrender. Onoda refused to appear. He believed these men were enemy collaborators. He believed the war continued. Every attempt to approach him only reinforced his conviction that the enemy was clever, persistent, and deceptive. The idea that Japan had surrendered simply did not fit the world he lived in, nor the orders he carried deep within his mind. Years continued to pass. Onoda's companions eventually died or surrendered, but his mission did not end. Now alone, he carried the war on his own shoulders, refusing to let time weaken what duty demanded he uphold. In the silence of the forest, he sharpened his skills, studied new hiding places, memorized every path, every slope, every clearing. The jungle was no longer something he survived. It was something he understood intimately, almost spiritually. Onoda became a ghost to the villagers, a myth to the children, a problem to the police, a legend to the military, and a symbol to a world that barely believed he still existed. 2 decades passed. The world entered the jet age. Nations rose and fell. Technologies changed. Wars began and ended. But in the shadows of Lubang, Hiroa Onoda remained. A soldier without an army, a man without a war, a memory that refused to fade, and a duty that refused to die.
The jungle of Lubang was vast, alive, and indifferent. It swallowed everything: footprints, whispers, hopes, even time itself. For Hiroa Onoda, it became both sanctuary and prison, a place where the war could continue forever because nothing in the jungle contradicted what he believed. Every morning began the same way: rising quietly, checking gear, scanning the forest for signs of movement. The humidity wrapped around him like a heavy blanket. The buzzing of insects became the jungle's endless chorus. The smell of wet earth clung to him as persistently as his orders. Food was never guaranteed. Sometimes he found coconuts or wild bananas. Other times he hunted birds or monitored rice fields from afar, waiting for the right moment to slip in and take just enough to survive. Each act of survival felt like duty. Each stolen grain was, in his mind, a blow against the enemy. The jungle taught him patience. He learned how to dry meat over small fires that produced no visible smoke. He learned which streams flowed cleanest during the rainy season, which animals left tracks at dawn, and which plants he could eat without poisoning himself. He lived as an extension of the environment, not a visitor in it. However, the forest was also relentless. Insects burrowed under clothes. Leeches clung to skin without warning. The heat was suffocating, the rain sudden and violent. Nights were filled with unseen movements, rustling leaves, shifting branches, the eerie cry of animals that moved silently through the darkness. Onoda became intimately familiar with fear, yet he refused to let it break him. Fear, he believed, was a tool. It sharpened awareness. It kept him alive. In a war of shadows and silence, fear was the closest thing he had to an ally. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. Onoda had no calendar, no way to measure the passage of time, except the changing phases of the moon and the growth of plants he had observed for seasons on end. What the world outside marked in days, he marked in storms and harvests. He sometimes found newspapers left along trails. To him, these were enemy deceptions. Why would the enemy not fake a newspaper? Why would they not spread lies to lure him out? The more the world tried to speak to him, the more he assumed it was trickery. Local villagers often saw him or signs of him: a footprint by a riverbank, a broken branch, a trap left behind. Stories spread about a lone soldier who moved like a ghost through the underbrush. Children whispered about the man in the trees. Farmers warned each other to guard their fields. Onoda heard these sounds carried on the wind, distant voices, occasional laughter, the crackle of radios from villages. Yet they felt unreal to him, part of a world he could not trust. Every voice could be an enemy. Every sound could be bait. His training had taught him that deception was everywhere, and so he faded deeper into the forest.
The psychological toll grew heavier each year. With each monsoon season, with each dry spell, with each new scar, he carried not only physical exhaustion, but emotional weight. Doubt occasionally tugged at the edges of his mind, but doubt was dangerous. Doubt could get him killed. Doubt could be betrayal, so he buried doubt beneath duty. He often revisited the orders given to him in 1944, replaying them in his mind like a sacred chant. Maintain operations. Do not surrender. Do not die by your own hand. Continue until relieved. These words became the architecture of his thoughts, the pillars supporting his reality when everything else faded. When his comrades died or surrendered, their absence carved deep wounds inside him. Their voices, their presence, their opinions had once served as anchors to sanity. But now he was alone, the last echo of a mission the world had forgotten. Their loss strengthened his resolve. If he surrendered now, their sacrifices would be meaningless. He maintained hidden camps, small clearings beneath dense foliage where he could rest unseen. He built rough shelters from bamboo, palm leaves, and vines. He stored food in elevated baskets to keep it away from animals. Some nights he barely slept, tensing at every sound in the darkness. The jungle tested him constantly. Storms broke open the sky, unleashing rivers of rain that soaked him to the bone. Trees crashed down without warning. Mosquitoes carried fevers. Cuts became infections. Hunger gnawed at him relentlessly. But nothing was as dangerous as time itself.
Time eroded memories. Time blurred truth. Time made isolation into a companion that whispered doubts and fantasies with equal clarity. Time could turn a soldier into a ghost. But Onoda refused to become a ghost. He clung to the version of reality he had been trained to trust, a reality where Japan was still fighting, where the empire had not surrendered, where his actions still mattered. During some nights, he looked at the stars through breaks in the foliage. The constellations reminded him of a world he once knew, a world of city lights, family dinners, laughter. But those memories felt like dreams from another lifetime. The jungle had become more real than anything else. In the early years, Onoda believed rescue or reinforcements might come. He maintained a cycle of observation and vigilance, always searching for signs of approaching troops. But as the 1950s passed into the 1960s, that hope faded. If rescue did not come, it meant only one thing. The war still demanded his presence on this island.
He continued to interpret signs through the lens of war. When military aircraft passed overhead, he assumed they were scouting him. When new villagers appeared on the island, he believed they were enemy settlers or undercover soldiers. When he found abandoned items, radios, clothes, tools, he suspected traps. The world had changed in dramatic ways, entering the atomic age, sending satellites into orbit, broadcasting news across continents. But Onoda remained locked inside a world frozen in 1945. The jungle was his battlefield, his refuge, his prison, and he saw no reason to leave it. As the years accumulated, Onoda's persistence took on a symbolic dimension. Unknown to him, he had become a legend across Japan. Stories circulated about the soldier who refused to surrender. Books mentioned his name in passing, but many believed he must have died long ago. No man, they thought, could survive the jungle for that long. Yet Onoda endured, not because he was stronger than others, but because he believed with an intensity few could understand. His reality was not dictated by newspapers or propaganda leaflets. His reality was anchored to orders he considered sacred. By the late 1960s, rumor and myth blurred together. Journalists occasionally visited Lupang. Treasure hunters explored the forest. Some even claimed to have seen a man watching them from the shadows, but no one could find him. The island began to treat him not as a man, but as a phantom. He had survived more than 20 decades in the jungle. He had outlasted insects, storms, disease, and loneliness. But his greatest survival was psychological. He had preserved a sense of purpose in a world that no longer supported it. Every day was a continuation of the last. Every night carried the same quiet rhythm. And even as the world moved into a new era with televisions, highways, and modern cities, Hiryo Onoda continued his solitary war beneath the ancient trees of Lubang. Nearly 30 years had passed, but the man who refused to surrender still listened for orders, still avoided traps, still patrolled the forest with a sense of duty unbroken by time.
For most people, the end of a war comes with news headlines, peace treaties, fireworks, and celebrations. But in the dense jungle of Lubang, peace was just another rumor carried by the wind. And rumors were weapons of deception, or so Onoda believed. The first attempts to reach him came shortly after the war officially ended in 1945. American forces dropped leaflets from aircraft announcing Japan's surrender and urging remaining soldiers to come out. The leaflets fluttered down like white birds, drifting among the trees until they caught on branches or fell onto muddy ground. Onoda read them carefully, examining the paper, the printing style, the tone. To him, they appeared suspicious. The wording felt too informal, the paper too thin, the timing too convenient. Everything in his training warned him that the enemy would use deception to lure soldiers into surrender. If the enemy wanted him alive, that alone was reason to distrust the message. Months later, more leaflets were dropped, this time printed with official seals and signatures from Japanese commanders. Again, Onoda studied them. If these were real, he reasoned, then the war must be going very poorly for Japan, so poorly that his enemies were forging documents to manipulate him. He dismissed them entirely. Years passed. In 1950, a group of local villagers found one of the leaflets and brought it closer to Onoda's abandoned campsite. They hoped he might see it, believe it, and return to civilization. But again he refused. The signatures seemed slightly off. The paper felt newer than it should have. The whole thing felt staged. The jungle had become his filter for truth. If something did not match the world he had built in his mind, then it could not be real. Throughout the 1950s, rumors about a Japanese soldier living in the jungle persisted. Journalists wrote brief notes. Locals shared stories about stolen rice and occasional gunshots. But most outsiders assumed the soldier was either myth or already dead. It wasn't until the early 1950s that a more serious attempt was made to contact him. Japanese officials, learning of ongoing sightings, organized a search party. They used megaphones to broadcast messages, urging any remaining soldiers to surrender. They even brought family members of missing soldiers to call into the forest. Onoda watched from the shadows, hidden behind thick leaves. He heard voices speaking Japanese, voices calling his name. But he could not trust them. He had been told the enemy was clever, capable of mimicking voices, capable of manipulating emotions. To answer those calls might mean stepping into a trap. He remained silent. Every failed attempt only reinforced his belief that the enemy was desperate to capture him. It made him feel more important, more necessary, more certain that his mission mattered. It is a strange truth of human psychology. When a belief is threatened, it often grows stronger.
During the late 1950s, local authorities grew more concerned. Onoda and his dwindling group, at that time still 3 men, occasionally shot at villagers or at patrols. To them, these encounters were battles. To the villagers, they were tragedies. Misunderstandings deepened. Tension grew. Onoda still believed that anyone approaching him was a collaborator or an enemy scout. When one of his remaining comrades surrendered in 1950 after losing faith, Onoda interpreted it as a betrayal, or worse, evidence that the surrendered man had been replaced by an enemy decoy. The jungle taught him to trust nothing except his orders. In 1952, Japan's government mounted its most ambitious effort yet. Aircraft dropped letters written by Onoda's family, complete with photographs. The message was tender, pleading. His parents told him the war was over, that he had fulfilled his duty, that he was needed at home. Onoda studied the letters for days. The handwriting looked genuine. The photographs showed faces he remembered. Yet something felt wrong. He convinced himself the enemy had forged everything. In his mind, a war still raged across the Pacific. The enemy was powerful, cunning, wealthy, capable of recreating any document to trick him. The letters were left on the forest floor to rot. Through the late 1950s and early 1960s, Onoda continued to survive through guerrilla tactics. He lived in damp shelters, moved constantly, relied on small rivers for water, and hunted for food. The outside world advanced without him. Televisions became common. Satellites orbited Earth. Nations shifted alliances. Yet nothing disturbed Onoda's internal timeline. The 1960s brought another wave of attempts to communicate with him. By this time, he was believed to be the last Japanese holdout on Lubang. His existence had become a curiosity, a symbol of unwavering loyalty or tragic delusion, depending on who told the story.
Japanese students, activists, and journalists occasionally traveled to the island. Some entered the forest calling his name. Others left bundles of newspapers or magazines in hopes he would read them. But Onoda dismissed every effort. He found a radio once, abandoned near a village. It played modern Japanese music, upbeat, unfamiliar, filled with instruments he had never heard before. The sound unsettled him. He concluded it had to be propaganda designed to confuse him. Every new attempted communication only strengthened the walls of his reality. If the world had truly changed, why would the enemy work so hard to convince him? If Japan had truly surrendered, why would there be so many conflicting messages? Why did some newspapers claim peace while others mentioned unrelated conflicts? It all seemed an elaborate deception. The paradox was self-sustaining. By the late 1960s, Onoda was alone. The last of his comrades had died. His rifle, though worn and rusted, still functioned. His uniform was faded but intact. His sense of purpose remained unshaken.
He had not seen a Japanese officer since 1944. He had not heard a confirmed order since then either. But in his mind, the possibility of being relieved still existed. And so he waited. Meanwhile, the world outside grew increasingly fascinated by the idea of a man lost in time. Magazine articles speculated about him. Japanese television ran episodes discussing the possibility that a soldier still lived on Lubang. Schoolchildren learned his name as a metaphor for unwavering devotion. Yet no one could reach him. No words could break through the steel of his commitment. The island's local government, frustrated by decades of conflict, began to treat Onoda as a public problem. They wanted peace, they wanted safety, and they wanted the mysterious soldier to stop interfering with their lives. Patrols intensified, warnings were issued, but Onoda remained an invisible presence, always one step ahead. In Tokyo, people debated whether he was a hero, trapped in the past, or a man blinded by loyalty. But regardless of opinion, one truth stood. Onoda had become a symbol larger than himself. He represented the last ember of a war that had burned out long ago. By the early 1970s, Japan had become an economic powerhouse. Skyscrapers pierced the skyline. Bullet trains crossed the countryside. New generations grew up without memories of war. The old empire had become a modern nation, focused on progress rather than conquest. But somewhere in a Philippine jungle, Hiro Onoda still held a rifle, still believed in the emperor, still believed his mission mattered, still believed the war continued. The world had tried to reach him with leaflets, letters, broadcasts, and search parties. It had tried facts and emotion. It had tried urgency and compassion. And every attempt had failed. He was a man governed not by the present, but by the past. A past that he believed still shaped everything around him. A past that refused to release him. A past he felt obligated to protect, even when it existed only in his memory. Onoda's war continued because he carried it inside himself. The world could not end it for him. Only he could end it. But he had not yet received the one thing he needed, an order to stand down from the officer he trusted. That order would come, not from the government, not from the military, not from diplomats or generals. It would come from a young man, someone who traveled halfway across the world, not to hunt him, not to trick him, but simply to listen.
In 1972, nearly 3 decades after the war had ended, the world would discover that Hiro Onoda was not a myth, not a rumor, not a fading ghost of history, but a living man still fighting a war that time had abandoned.
and his discovery began with tragedy. That year, Onoda encountered a group of Filipino civilians near the forest edge. Believing they were enemy collaborators, he opened fire. One villager was killed. The news spread quickly across Lubang, then across the Philippines, then across Japan. Newspapers revived the legend. A Japanese soldier still fights on Lubang Island. For many, the story sounded absurd. How could anyone survive that long? How could a man so thoroughly ignore reality? But for one young Japanese man named Norio Suzuki, the story was not absurd. It was a calling. Suzuki was a 20-something adventurer, restless, curious, driven by a desire to find things the world believed were impossible. He had already traveled across continents, slept in deserts, crossed mountain ranges, and chased mysteries few dared to explore. When he read about Onoda, he wasn't skeptical, he was inspired. He famously told friends he wanted to find 3 things: a panda, a snowman, and Hiro Onoda. It was said half jokingly, half seriously, but beneath the humor was a genuine longing, a desire to touch something pure and unbroken in a world that felt increasingly modern and detached from meaning. Japan in the 1970s was prosperous, modern, and fast-changing. Suzuki felt out of place, but the idea of a man still living in the past, holding on to a mission with absolute conviction, that captured him. It represented something rare and beautiful, the idea that duty could outlast decades, jungles, governments, even time. And so, with a simple backpack, basic supplies, and a heart full of determination, Suzuki traveled to the Philippines. Locals warned him about the dangers. They spoke about the Japanese soldier in the jungle as if he were a spirit, unpredictable, elusive, possibly dangerous. But Suzuki was undeterred. He entered the forest alone. The jungle welcomed him with the same humid embrace it had offered Onoda decades before. Tall trees towered overhead, their leaves filtering sunlight into scattered patches of gold. The air was thick with the scent of wet soil and wild plants. Suzuki moved carefully, knowing every step could carry risk. He studied the terrain, listened to the wind, paid attention to the movement of birds. He behaved not like a tourist, but like someone trying to understand the rhythm of a living world. He knew Onoda would be watching long before he ever saw him. The key was not to scare him. It was to make himself visible in a way that felt non-threatening. He waded by streams, walked near old campsites, and left small traces of his presence intentionally. Onoda, hidden somewhere nearby, noticed all of it. He observed the footprints, the clothing, the posture. Something about this new presence felt different. Suspicious, yes, but also unusual. Unlike the heavily armed patrols or organized search parties, this young man carried little. He moved with lightness. He did not attempt to ambush or corner. He simply wandered.
Days passed. The jungle, in its own mysterious way, brought the two together. One morning, Suzuki stopped near a clearing. He set down his bag and calmly sat on a log, looking out into the trees, as if waiting for something, or someone. Hidden among the foliage, Onoda watched him. The young man showed no fear, no aggression, no military posture. He looked almost peaceful. Onoda did not recognize the modern clothing, but he recognized sincerity in the way Suzuki moved. This was not a soldier, not a trap, not an enemy agent. It was simply a man. The encounter that followed became one of the most extraordinary moments in post-war history. When Onoda stepped into sight, emerging from the trees with a rifle in his hands and decades of suspicion in his eyes, Suzuki did not run. He did not shout. He did not act surprised. He simply acknowledged him with calm respect. For Onoda, it was the first time in years he had allowed himself to be seen. For Suzuki, it was the confirmation that history still breathed in places no one expected. Suzuki spoke gently. Onoda listened cautiously. Though we will not reenact their conversation, history records that it was simple, sincere, and deeply human. Suzuki did not bring commands. He did not bring authority. He brought curiosity and empathy. That was what finally reached Onoda. For almost 30 years, every message Onoda encountered felt impersonal, strategic, or duty still anchored every thought. He told Suzuki he could not come out unless an officer, one of his former commanders, officially relieved him of his mission. It was a turning point. For the first time in decades, Onoda acknowledged the possibility that the war might be over, but only if someone he trusted said so.
Suzuki returned to Japan with a mission of his own, to find the man who had given Onoda his orders in 1944. That man was Lieutenant Yoshimi Taniguchi, who had long since retired from military life and was working as a bookseller. When he learned that Onoda was still alive, he wept. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him. The Japanese government agreed to send Taniguchi to Lubang. It was an unprecedented moment, a government retrieving a soldier from a war that had ended 3 decades earlier. But the matter was delicate. It required sensitivity. It required understanding. It required closure. Suzuki returned to the Philippines ahead of Taniguchi, waiting in the jungle for the moment that would define history. The people of Lubang prepared cautiously. The world watched with fascination. Finally, on March 9, 1974, Hiro Onoda emerged from the jungle. Thin, weathered, and carrying a rifle he had cared for with meticulous dedication, he walked toward the man who had once given him his orders. And for the first time in 30 years, he heard the words he had been waiting for. He was relieved of duty. The war ended for him in that moment, not with a treaty, not with a newspaper, not with a leaflet, but with the voice of a man who once shaped his purpose. Onoda removed his rifle and handed it over. It still functioned perfectly. He still wore patches of his original uniform. He had maintained everything he could, even as the world changed completely around him. When he bowed and surrendered his sword, the crowd fell silent. Some cried, some stared in disbelief. It was not merely a soldier returning, it was a life returning from a different era. He had survived nearly 30 years in the jungle. He had held on to his mission longer than entire generations lived. He had carried a war no one else could see. And now, for the first time since 1945, he stepped into a world that had finally caught up with him. The encounter between Suzuki and Onoda became a symbol of compassion, curiosity, and the power of human connection over time and trauma. Suzuki had not used force. He had not used authority. He had simply approached a lost soldier as a human being, not a relic. And that made all the difference. The world now had its miracle. A man returned from time itself, but his journey, emotional, cultural, and psychological, was far from over. The war inside him had ended, but the world outside, that required a new kind of survival.
When Hiroi Onoda stepped out of the jungle in 1974, the world he entered was unrecognizable. The Philippines had changed. Japan had changed. The entire planet had entered a new technological age. For Onoda, it felt like awakening from a dream, only to discover that the dream had lasted half a lifetime. Photographs capture that moment. A thin, disciplined figure standing beside officials, his posture rigid, his expression controlled. Around him, crowds pressed forward to glimpse the man who had fought a war no one else could see. To many, he appeared heroic. To others, tragic. But to Onoda himself, he was simply a soldier completing his mission. As reporters documented every detail of his appearance, his clothing, and his belongings, Onoda felt none of the excitement that surrounded him. The world celebrated him, but he saw only the vast distance between his internal reality and the external world he had returned to. The cameras felt intrusive, the noise overwhelming, the attention unfamiliar. He had lived in isolation for so long that social interactions felt unnatural. The jungle had trained him to listen to silence, to sense danger in subtle movements, to rely on instinct rather than conversation. Now, surrounded by people, he found himself retreating inward, watching everyone with the same disciplined vigilance that kept him alive for decades. When the plane took him from Manila to Tokyo, it was the first time he had flown in a modern aircraft. He scanned the cabin with caution, studying unfamiliar buttons, uniforms, and technology. The hum of the engines, the overhead lights, the polished surfaces, everything seemed like artifacts from a world decades beyond his understanding. As the plane landed, crowds waited at the airport. They cheered. They waved flags. They carried banners with his name. They saw a hero returning home after a lifetime of sacrifice. Onoda saw strangers who could not possibly understand what he had endured. Japan in 1974 was a nation of neon lights, modern trains, bustling streets, and booming economy. The imperial ideals he had once fought for were gone. The schools that once celebrated military honor now taught pacifism. Children who might have once saluted soldiers now learned about peace, democracy, and global cooperation. Onoda stepped into a world that no longer resembled the Japan he had vowed to protect. His first visit was to his family. The reunion was emotional, yet restrained. They welcomed him with warmth, but he felt a quiet discomfort, not because he did not love them, but because he no longer knew how to belong. He had left them as a young soldier with unwavering certainty. He returned as a man shaped by decades of solitude and survival. As he walked through Tokyo's streets, he was struck by the pace of life. Cars rushed past. People hurried into trains. Bright advertisements glowed above the sidewalks. He paused often, staring at things most people overlooked: telephone booths, vending machines, and electric signs. They were everyday objects, but to him they felt like signals from a future he had never imagined. Journalists clamored to interview him. Politicians praised him. Veterans honored him. But beneath the public admiration there was complexity. Some questioned his actions on Lubang. Others debated whether he should be held responsible for the villagers harmed during his guerrilla operations. The Japanese government, recognizing the unique psychological reality he had lived in, supported his release from liability. But public opinion remained divided. Onoda himself felt the weight of those decades of conflict. He did not justify violence. He saw it as part of the war he believed he was still fighting. When confronted by reporters about the incidents, he answered calmly, never defensively. His sincerity disarmed many. He had never acted with malice, only duty.
As days turned to weeks, Japan celebrated him with ceremonies, awards, and television appearances. He spoke with humility, describing his survival strategies, his understanding of duty, and the inner strength that allowed him to endure. But he also expressed a quiet confusion. He felt like a man displaced in time. He visited shrines, old neighborhoods, and places from his youth. Some were gone, others transformed beyond recognition. The old Japan lived only in his memory, like a photograph that had faded while he was away. The new Japan was vibrant, prosperous, peaceful, but alien to him. The weight of this cultural shift pressed heavily on his shoulders. He had expected his return to be a homecoming. Instead, it felt like entering a foreign country that happened to speak his language. He struggled with everyday things people took for granted:
Crossing busy streets felt chaotic after years of moving silently through trees. Restaurants overwhelmed him with noise. Simple interactions made him anxious. He had spent so long observing from the shadows that living openly felt strange, almost dangerous. Public celebrations eventually quieted, and Onoda was left with a life he did not know how to navigate. He tried to adjust, but the transition from jungle solitude to modern society carried a profound psychological burden. He was a man conditioned for war, living in an era of peace. Without mission, without orders, without structure, he felt adrift. Around this time, Norio Suzuki visited him again. Their bond had grown into something meaningful. Suzuki understood Onoda in ways few people could. They shared a sense of being outsiders, wanderers seeking purpose in a world that felt increasingly distant. But even Suzuki could not anchor him completely. The more Onoda attempted to integrate into society, the more he felt the shadows of Lubang calling back to him. The jungle had been harsh, but it had also been simple. It had given him purpose, clarity, discipline. The modern world gave him none of those things. So, Onoda made a decision. He left Japan. He moved to Brazil, where the land was vast, the pace of life slower, and the expectations fewer. There he took up farming. The work was physical, grounding, steady, and deeply familiar. It allowed him to reconnect with the earth, feel the rhythm of seasons, and escape the chaos that Tokyo had imposed on him. In Brazil, he found companionship and eventually married. He built a new life, not as a soldier, but as a man learning how to live outside the shadow of duty. The forest around his farm reminded him of Lubang, but without the fear. It became a place of healing rather than survival.
Yet even as he built this new life, the memories of the jungle lingered. He carried the weight of every decision he had made, every year he had lived alone, every moment of hesitation, fear, and endurance. But he did not run from these memories. He embraced them. They were part of him, woven into the fabric of his identity. In time, Japan invited him back for public speaking and education programs. Onoda accepted these opportunities. He spoke to young people about perseverance, about conviction, about the importance of understanding one's purpose. He warned against blind obedience. He encouraged thoughtful reflection. He shared not only his story, but the lessons carved from decades of survival. Ironically, the man who once followed orders without question now urged others to think for themselves. His time in the jungle had reshaped him, not into a symbol of unwavering loyalty, but into a symbol of resilience and critical thought. He wrote a memoir detailing the experience, offering the world insight into the mental labyrinth that kept him in the jungle for so long. His honesty resonated with people. It explained not only the mechanics of survival, but the psychology of belief, how a mission can become identity, how identity can become prison. Onoda returned frequently to Japan, not to live, but to remind people of history, of dedication, of humanity's capacity for endurance and error. He walked the streets that once overwhelmed him with more confidence. He spoke to crowds with calm self-assurance. He had found peace not by erasing the past, but by integrating it. The jungle had shaped him. Japan had changed him. Brazil had grounded him. He had lived 3 lives: soldier, survivor, teacher. But one final chapter of his life would remind the world how fragile existence can be,
even for men who survive the impossible. It came in the form of another tragedy, not his own, but that of the young man who found him, who believed in him, who gave him the path back to the world. The loss of that young man would carve a wound deeper than any he suffered in the jungle.
In Brazil, Hiro Onoda finally found the quiet he had been denied for 3 decades. The open skies, the warm soil, and the vast land gave him something he had forgotten existed: stillness without fear. But even in this peace, he was not immune to the pains of life. The jungle had taught him survival, but it could not teach him how to navigate the fragility of human relationships. One of the deepest wounds came from the death of Norio Suzuki, the young adventurer who had walked into the jungle to find him. Suzuki had become more than the man who ended Onoda's war. He was a rare soul who saw the world through the same lens of curiosity and wonder. They shared a bond that transcended time and generations. When news reached Onoda that Suzuki had died in the Himalayas during one of his expeditions, the grief struck him with unexpected force. Suzuki had been young, full of life, full of questions still waiting to be explored. His search for meaning had taken him to dangerous places, and this time the mountain claimed him. Onoda carried Suzuki's memory like a lantern inside his heart, bright, guiding, irreplaceable. The man who had saved him from an endless war had left the world too soon. It reminded Onoda of something he had learned only after leaving Lubang. The world outside the jungle was full of unpredictable tragedies, often crueler than the dangers he faced alone. As the years passed, Onoda's life became a blend of reflection and purpose. He spoke frequently about perseverance, but he also spoke of caution, warning young people not to follow orders blindly, not to confuse obedience with meaning, not to allow loyalty to override truth. His words carried the weight of experience few could comprehend. Schools invited him to share his story. Veterans welcomed him with honor. Scholars studied him as a psychological marvel. But Onoda refused to see himself as extraordinary. He insisted that he had simply done the only thing he believed was right. His humility was as striking as his endurance. Still, he understood the symbolic role he now held. To some, he represented unwavering loyalty. To others, the dangers of ideology taken too far. To many, he was a reminder of how war scars the mind long after the fighting ends. He stood at the crossroads of these interpretations, neither embracing nor rejecting any of them. He simply existed, a living testament to human complexity. His farm in Brazil became a sanctuary of sorts. Fences, animals, fields, they grounded him in the present. Each sunrise over the land felt like a small reassurance that he was no longer living inside an illusion. He tended crops with quiet dedication, moving through the fields as he once moved through the jungle, with attentiveness, discipline, and respect.
Occasionally, visitors traveled far to meet him. They saw not the ghostly soldier of legend, but a gentle man who carried profound wisdom beneath his calm exterior. He spoke softly, listened deeply, and treated every person with careful sincerity. The scars of the past endured, but they did not define him. Instead, they shaped the lessons he wished to share. He visited Japan from time to time, reconnecting with a homeland that continued to evolve. He saw skyscrapers rise, technology advance, generations grow more distant from the era he had lived through. Each return reminded him how much the world could change, while one person remained unchanged. but he no longer felt like a stranger. He had found balance, not between past and present, but between understanding and acceptance. Onoda was asked often how he survived so long in the jungle. He answered with honesty, discipline, routine, clarity of purpose. But beneath these practical explanations was something deeper, an unyielding sense of identity. When a person believes they are essential to something greater than themselves, endurance becomes instinctive. His mission had become his reason to live. Yet as he aged, he reflected more critically on that mission. He acknowledged the pain caused on Lubang, the misunderstandings, the tragedies that unfolded because of his presence. He did not excuse them. He understood them as consequences of a world that had collapsed around him without warning. In his speeches, he urged others to learn from his story, not to repeat it. In time, he founded a youth nature camp in Japan, teaching children survival skills, teamwork, and respect for nature. It was his way of turning the harsh lessons of the jungle into something constructive. The children listened to him with awe. To them, he was a man who had lived a life closer to legend than reality. But Onoda saw something simple, young minds that deserved guidance, not indoctrination. He taught them how to build fires, how to read the forest, how to navigate by the stars. But the real lessons lay beneath the surface, about resilience, responsibility, and the importance of questioning what one is told. He wanted them to know that loyalty without wisdom could become a trap, and that purpose should never overshadow humanity. His later years were surprisingly peaceful. He tended his farm, mentored youth, traveled occasionally, and embraced the normalcy he had once been denied. The shadows of Lubang no longer haunted him. Instead, they became stories he shared with tenderness, not fear.
The world viewed Onoda through money lenses. Some admired him, some criticized him, some pitied him. But regardless of perspective, his story touched a universal truth. Humans are capable of extraordinary endurance, extraordinary belief, and extraordinary transformation. When he passed away in 2014 at the age of 91, tributes came from around the globe. Journalists revisited his story. Historians discussed his legacy. People debated what his life represented. Loyalty? Delusion? Duty? Survival? Perhaps all of them. Perhaps none. What mattered most was not how he was labeled, but what his story revealed about the human condition. He had lived a life suspended between two worlds, the world of war he could not leave, and the world of peace he struggled to enter. He had walked through jungles of fear and jungles of memory. He had survived both. His legacy is not a simple lesson. It is a mirror, reflecting the complexities of conviction, the fragility of truth, and the resilience of the human spirit. It invites us to ask difficult questions. What would we hold on to if the world changed without telling us? What beliefs would we cling to when everything familiar dissolves? How long could we endure a reality built on duty alone? Hiro Onoda's life reminds us that survival is not only physical, it is psychological, emotional, and deeply personal. He carried a war inside him long after the world laid down its weapons. And in the end, he found peace not by erasing the past, but by learning to live beyond it. His story endures because it reveals something profound. Even the strongest convictions can evolve. Even the deepest wounds can heal. And even those lost in time can find their way back, not to the world they left,
but to the world they choose to build.
When a man carries a war inside him for 30 years, the rest of his life becomes an act of unlearning. For Hiroo Onoda, peace was not a moment. It was a process, slow and fragile, unfolding over decades. And in the quiet of his final years, he came to understand something that neither the jungle nor the battlefield had been able to teach him, that time is its own kind of truth. He had lived through eras that most people only read about in history books. He had crossed boundaries, not geographical ones, but psychological ones that few could comprehend. And yet, as the years softened him, he found comfort not in his extraordinary past, but in the simplicity of ordinary life. There is a strange beauty in the way Onoda's life unfolded. He began as a soldier shaped by discipline, belief, and duty. He survived as a man alone in the wilderness, relying on instinct and conviction. And he ended as a teacher, guiding young minds not away from hardship, but toward understanding. He often said that the jungle had not broken him, it had revealed him. In isolation, every weakness becomes visible, every fear becomes amplified, every uncertainty becomes a shadow. But in those shadows he found resilience, clarity, and a deeper understanding of what it means to be human. His story forces us to confront the question of identity. Who are we when everything we know changes? Who are we when the world moves on without us? Who are we when the beliefs that once defined us dissolve into history? For 30 years, Onoda answered these questions through action rather than thought. He survived because survival was the only language he understood. But once freed from the jungle, he began to see the larger picture, the ways in which belief can shape reality, and how reality can remain hidden when belief becomes absolute. People often asked him if he regretted the years he lost. Onoda never gave a simple answer. Regret, like war, is complex. He acknowledged the tragedy, the time taken from him, the pain caused on Lubang, the decades spent fighting an enemy that no longer existed. But he also recognized the strength those years forged within him, the lessons carved into his spirit.
He carried both truths, the burden and the wisdom. As he aged, he became gentler in his reflections, not softer. Onodita never became soft, but more willing to consider perspectives he once could not imagine. The world he returned to was bigger than the world he left, and as he walked through it, he began to appreciate its complexity rather than fear it. Sometimes he would speak of the nights in the jungle, the stars visible through broken branches. Those stars became companions, markers of time, reminders of a universe that did not change, even when everything else did. He said they gave him comfort, not because they guided him, but because they listened silently, without judgment. In those stars, perhaps, he saw glimpses of the world that waited for him beyond the war, a world where meaning was not given by orders, but discovered through choice. As his story spread, people interpreted it differently. Some admired his loyalty. Some saw cautionary lessons about the dangers of blind obedience. Others saw a testament to resilience. Onodita never insisted on one interpretation. He understood that stories take on lives of their own, shaped by those who hear them. His own life had been shaped that way too, molded by a nation's expectations, a commander's instructions, and a war that demanded total
Symbol. But at the core, he was something more simple.
Good evening, fellow adventurers. How are you today? I hope you're doing well and ready to journey through time together with Nightly Historian.
For 30 years, the world moved on, but one man did not. While nations rebuilt, children grew into adults, and an entire generation forgot the sounds of gunfire,
Hiro Onoda remained hidden beneath the canopy of a tropical jungle, holding his rifle, guarding his orders, convinced that the war he served had never truly ended. To understand why, we must begin long before the jungle swallowed him. We must step into a time when Japan still believed in an empire of destiny, when obedience was sacred, and when surrender was not just unthinkable, it was shame itself. His story is not merely about endurance, but about the human mind was absolute. There was no hint then that he would become one of the most enigmatic figures of the 20th century. He was an ordinary boy raised in an extraordinary culture. As he grew older, the world was changing in ways no one could predict. Japan's rising militarization seeped into everyday life, transforming schools into training grounds and shaping young minds around loyalty and sacrifice. For Onoda, these ideas were not burdens, they were structure, purpose, a path forward. When he entered adulthood, the empire was already deep in conflict across Asia and the Pacific. And as the war expanded, so did the demand for soldiers capable not only of fighting, but of surviving. Onoda's unique blend of calmness, determination, and obedience made him an ideal candidate for a very different kind of assignment, one that required not strength, but unwavering faith. In the early 1940s, the Japanese Army identified recruits suitable for specialized training in guerrilla warfare. These were not soldiers meant to win battles. They were soldiers meant to outlast them. Their mission was simple in theory, but impossible in practice. Infiltrate, disrupt, and gather intelligence. And above all, never surrender. Onoda braced this path without hesitation. It was not bravado or pride. It was duty, a word he understood as one might understand gravity, something that holds you to the earth, whether you wish it to or not.
Among these orders was one that defined his fate. You must never die by your own hand, and under no circumstances may you surrender. This was not optional. This was not metaphor. This was doctrine. When Onoda completed his training, the empire sent him to a small island in the Philippines called Lubang. He arrived in late 1944, a young intelligence officer with a precise mission: destroy enemy supplies, maintain guerrilla pressure, and gather information. If the main Japanese forces retreated, he was not to retreat with them. If the war appeared lost, he was not to believe it. If anyone tried to convince him otherwise, he was to assume it was part of an enemy trick. Lubang's jungle greeted him with dense humidity, towering trees, and a silence broken only by insects and distant waves. It was not a battlefield in the traditional sense. It was a labyrinth of green, a place where truth disappeared between shadows. Onoda studied it carefully, learning its paths, its hiding places, and its dangers. He did not know then that this jungle would become his home for 3 decades. As 1945 approached, the situation in the Pacific worsened. Japan's defeat drew closer with each passing week. But to Onoda and his small group of comrades, the world outside the jungle remained unseen, abstract, unreachable. All they knew were their orders, orders that did not change even as the empire crumbled. In February 1945, American forces launched their assault on Lubang. The Japanese troops stationed there were quickly overwhelmed, and many were forced to retreat or were captured. Onoda and a handful of surviving soldiers melted into the forest, disappearing into its endless folds just as they'd been trained to do. For most soldiers, retreating into the jungle was a temporary measure. For Onoda, it became a destiny he could not escape.
Day after day, Onoda and his men listened for signals, searched for surviving comrades, and waited for new commands. But none came.
They saw leaflets dropped from aircraft, papers claiming that the war had ended. They found newspapers declaring Japan's surrender. They heard announcements played through speakers by local police, urging them to come out. But Onoda had been trained well. He knew the enemy used deception. He had been taught that surrender propaganda was common, and so he dismissed every message, every leaflet, every plea as a trap. The more the world tried to reach him, the deeper he retreated into his mission. As months became years, the jungle stopped being a temporary refuge and became his universe. Time lost its meaning. Seasons blended into each other. The only truths that remained were the orders he had received, orders he had never been told to abandon. The island became a vast and living clock. The cicadas signaled heat. The storms signaled hunger. The rustling leaves at dusk signaled danger. Onoda learned to read the forest as one might read a language. Food was scarce. They rationed everything: rice, coconuts, captured livestock, even wild plants they barely recognized. Illness was constant. Nights were cold. Days were harsh. But through it all, Onoda held fast to his purpose, to continue the war, no matter how long it took. As the 1950s arrived, Lubang's villagers began reporting sightings of Japanese holdouts in the jungle. Occasionally, shots were fired in the dark. Farmers whispered about figures stealing rice or killing livestock. Local law enforcement tried to make contact, urging the soldiers to surrender,